I'm super excited to be with you all again. Just like I was telling on my joy that like how just what a warm, great community it is here, and how nice just to share time, and then having the youth read yet last Sunday was just really just a special thing. Just sort of the familial relationships that are here. I think that's just awesome. So I feel like it's kind of like the early church in a way, just like how it was just like a family of people that came together and kind of shared themselves and not all that formality, but whatever. But I think that's kind of what it's all about. Well, so I guess just to kind of keep talking a little bit about what we talked about, last week, a little bit about the Gospels, and maybe I thought that today, maybe quick recap of last week, then kind of like what is a gospel in general? What does that word mean? And then what if we looked at just maybe a passage or so from each of the four, and then and say, well, how does that exhibit what the main themes are? Even though just one passage could in no way really represent what the themes of the different four gospels are, because they're so. I mean, you'd need to read every word, I guess, to really fully get it, but just to get a little snippet of each of the four. So just a quick thing to say from kind of bit from last week, that just how important it is to understand a little bit about the window into the past. How is the gospel a window into what was going on at the time, and a little bit of a mirror into understanding us in our own life today. Because I think without those two things, like why have the scripture? It becomes either just a story about something ancient or some reflecting some ancient time that's not connected to us at all, but it's interesting to think about, or it's just me and I make it up myself how I see it myself, and then that's not exactly living in community and living in a context and understanding what this really is. It's a sacred text that comes to us to kind of guide our life and guide our how we relate to one another. So I think we need a little bit of both. So that's great. Then to kind of say specifically about the Gospels that there were certain like teachings or maybe liturgical statements or prayers that people gathered around and centered around, and then maybe those liturgical statements or prayers turned into stories and maybe remembrances of the historical activity of Jesus, and then kind of became an oral tradition, and then were written down in different times. And so we know that there are four Gospels that are chosen as what we call canonical Gospels. That's a fancy word, canonical. It means that like sort of like canon was a word in the old days that sort of it was a reed. It meant like a little reed. It was almost, the reed was like the ruler. So that like how you measured things, they didn't have like a ruler or a tape measure. They used a little reed to kind of measure how many ever this or that. And so the canon or the reed or the measurement were things that were used as like a sort of how we kind of measured our life, or the things that we sort of tried to stand up to measure up to in a way, if that makes sense. And so not all the Gospels that were written became canonical. They were like apocryphal. So that means that they were outside of our kind of canon. So there were other Gospels that were written that really we didn't really rely on, that didn't become part of this important thing that we believe is sacred scripture, divinely coming to us and all that. So there's that. I'll talk about that really quickly. But of these four Gospels, we know that there's sort of like two sort of authorship strands. One being the synoptic Gospels, syn, same, optic, same eye, sort of seen with the same eye, because they sort of go through with the same sort of timeline of how things unfolded. And we think that the theory there is this the synoptic problem is what they called it. That how did these three Gospels kind of come about a little bit differently yet very similarly? And the problem they attempted to solve with was that Mark was written early and first, and there was another source of sayings and of Jesus and activities of Jesus that existed at the same time, maybe even a little earlier than Mark. And then what happened was that the authors of Matthew and the authors of Luke then drew on Mark and this other source. We call the other source Q, Quelle, which is a German word. It's a German theory, and the word Quelle means source. So this source plus Mark kind of informed Matthew and Luke, and then Luke and Matthew also had their own sources. So that's sort of the synoptic problem that we just solved, and then to a theory, and then the other being the Johannine literature being written much later. The Gospel of John being written probably later, and we're looking at maybe 70-ish for Mark, 80s for Matthew and Luke, and then 95, 100 for John. So we're getting pretty far away from the actual events, but that just shows the staying power of the message and the story, and just how important the message and the story is, and how here we are now, 2,000 plus years later, still building our lives around this. It's pretty amazing. So okay, I mentioned those four other gospels. So if we were to look at, if we were to kind of get and use that window and look back in the old days and see what exactly did the term gospel mean. Evangelium, it was a Greek word. And so this word evangelium was used outside of the word gospel. That word gospel, it was just a kind of a common literary sort of style. And it meant good news, or a happy announcement would be a better way to kind of say it. Here's a happy announcement. So the Gospels, a lot of time, this literary genre would be announcing the emperor's birth, or announcing the emperor's birthday, or somebody, there was maybe some royal wedding, or maybe there was some big thing that was going on. That was the Gospel. So it's interesting that was the term that was really utilized. Sort of like big headlines, big happy announcements, that you kind of see on the front page of the scroll that you got in the morning, or whatever, So Mark being the earliest and kind of a little bit more, I mean primitive and not in a negative way, but more basic, or more, just kind of a key earlier style, was a little bit most like this actual gospel literary genre, because it is a series of just stories and things that are told. They're sort of strung together by and then, so it's this thing of combinations, and then he did this, and now for something completely different, kind of move to something else, and then to something else. So that's kind of how it was strung together. So really, that was this style. So Mark, it's that sort of a collection of headlines that were put together. It's really, the gospel is not to be confused with a biography, like somebody who was sitting there, like a guy named Matthew sat down and wrote it all. So that's just to remember. But there were other gospels. There were a bunch of other gospels, actually. And so these other gospels, say for instance, there's a gospel of Mary, a gospel of Mary of Magdala, the gospel of Thomas, and then there's an infancy gospel of Thomas. So there's these different gospels that were written. The reason that they probably didn't land in the sacred scripture, that we have it as a canonical, thing that we measure our life by, is because they were maybe had a purpose, or a purpose outside of just sharing the good news. Might have had another purpose of hey, I have this philosophy I want to promote, so therefore I'm going to write this story about Jesus and sort of promote my belief by putting it in the lips and the mouth and the activities of Jesus, if that makes sense. So I think earlier people could have seen that coming. They call, one of the things they call this Gnostic sort of philosophy, or whatever, that if you know certain things, then you're destined for salvation, things like that aren't implied in any of the other gospels. So here's an example of maybe why some of those gospels didn't make it into the cut of the canonical gospel. So just to give a little taste, it's they're not trying to keep us from things, but here's this passage. This is from the infancy gospel of Thomas. Okay, and it starts out, the stories of Thomas the Israelite, the philosopher, concerning the works of the childhood of the Lord. Okay, it goes on, I, Thomas, tell unto you, it goes on. Okay, then it says, this little child Jesus, when he was 5 years old, was playing at the ford of a brook, and he gathered together the waters that flowed there into pools, and made them straightway clean, and commanded them by his word alone. Even as a little kid, he was having some great miracles. And so, and having made soft clay, he fashioned thereof 12 sparrows. And it was the Sabbath that he did these things. And there were also many other little children playing with him. Okay, a certain Jewish man came, and when he saw what Jesus did, playing upon the Sabbath day, departed straightway, and told his father Joseph, Lo, thy child is at the brook, and he has taken clay and fashioned 12 little birds, and they've polluted the Sabbath day. And Joseph came to the place and saw, and cried out to Jesus and said, how are you doing these things on the Sabbath? Is it that it's not lawful to do? But Jesus clapped his hands together and cried out to the sparrows and said to them, Go. And the sparrows took their flight, and they went away chirping. And when the Jews saw this, they were amazed, and they departed and told their chief men what had happened. But then the son of Amos, the scribe, was standing there with Joseph, and he took a branch of willow and dispersed the waters which Jesus had gathered together. When Jesus saw this was done,
He said, "O evil, ungodly, and foolish one." This is Jesus talking to that guy. "What hurt did the pools do?" And then he comes on and makes the birds attack the guy. Jesus does. So probably you can see why that didn't make those types of things. Anyway, but so you can kind of see why these gospel passages weren't exactly included in the canonical scripture that we read on Sunday. And after that, say "Word of the Lord" or something, So that's so that's kind of amazing. But back to the main point. But I think just real quick, like the movie the Da Vinci Code, that was, so they had to refer to these canonical gospels a lot in that. That was but that was all fictional kind of stuff. So in fact, there were some inaccuracies. Anyway, but that's only a geek like me would figure it out. So anyway, well, let's just real quick. Let's see. Let's say one quick thing about overall, and then we'll kind of look at maybe 4 different passages from each of one from each. So, but it's kind of interesting to see a development of the understanding of who Jesus was in the actual writing of the scriptures. So, say for instance, early on, we talked about this last week, that passage from Thessalonians about Jesus' resurrection from the dead, his death and resurrection. Kind of seeing and viewing Jesus and understanding Jesus as God, Son of God, divine as the Messiah, or understanding that insight, but understanding it in light of the resurrection. So that was then. Then, if you go to the Gospel of Mark, which is probably the next authorship, next written thing historically, you see Jesus being recognized as Son of God at his baptism. So there at the baptism. So it's a little bit earlier. Oh, I get it. So at the baptism. Then Matthew and Luke acknowledge Jesus' kind of messiahship, divinity, Son of God at his birth, through the stories as birth. But then, so you can kind of see this greater understanding of Jesus. Then by the time John is written in 95 or 100, we see the Logos has always been. So you can see that the understanding of Christ's presence with God in all time. And so we kind of see this. It's fascinating to me to see this development of a theology or development of an understanding of who Christ is in our world and in the universe. And so I feel like that makes me feel a little bit better, because sometimes I look back at my own life and I think, well, gee, I feel like at certain points I understood one aspect of Jesus, but maybe I didn't fully get it because of my life experiences or whatever. So our lives evolve in our faith, and that's awesome. That's great. We may be at one place at one point, but in another place later. It's really reflecting the experience of the Christian community, the earliest Christian community, by growing and allowing ourselves to grow in our faith. I think that's pretty awesome to see that they grew, and we're challenged to grow too. So that's pretty amazing. Well, let's look for a second at the Gospel of Mark. So Mark, again, like I said, probably the earliest, and it's do you remember that the title, the name Mark, Matthew, or Luke weren't like a guy named Mark that sat down and wrote it down. There's probably a community of people, or maybe one leader or one redactor or one editor that might have pulled it together. But they sort of attribute it maybe that the name John Mark from Acts 12:12 that's mentioned in the book of Acts, that maybe that's who this person that it's attributed to. So I think that's kind of significant a little bit. So just a couple things that Mark was probably written primarily to a largely, sort of a mixture of Jewish people and historically Jewish people and Gentiles. So in the area where Mark was geographically was probably primarily Gentile. But the messages, of course, are sent to people of the Israelite heritage too. So there are in this gospel, you can kind of see just this interweaving of things kind of giving a nod towards the Gentiles and a little bit about giving a nod towards the Jewish people and how it's kind of weaved together really well. So I'll give a couple of examples here real quick. So just at the very, very offset, I think it's sort of like a connection or a harking in a way to the Torah, to the Old Testament. And all 4 Gospels do this in some sort of a way. So the very first line, chapter 1, verse 1, the beginning of the good news. So this would be not in Greek, but in Greek could be translated as Bereshit, which is the very, very first line of the book of Genesis. In the beginning, in the beginning is the gospel. So this is the beginning of the gospel, of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, right there. as it is written in the prophet Isaiah. So here, right off, here, almost like a direct quote or connection to the Old Testament. So it sort of shows theologically, there's sort of like a parallel. Like here's a creation, the very first creation, and here's a new creation in Jesus. New creation in Jesus. So that's, I think, a huge deal. That we're being recreated. This is a redoing, a rebirthing, a re-experiencing of a new creation. So I think that's sort of theologically there, but also trying to create a little bit of a home for people that were Jewish, to say, okay, well, all right, well, I get this. This is starting to use my language here. I feel comfortable in this already, if that makes sense. So that's that. But then Mark continues, I think, to a little bit of a nod towards the Jewish population listening or reading this. It says, as it was written in the prophet Isaiah, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. This is interesting. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness. Now, here in Greek in the Gospel of Mark, there's a colon right there. There's just like a pause or a stop. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness. So the voice is coming from the wilderness in this passage. And then it says, in quote, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. So this is setting it up for John the Baptist, because he was sort of like an image of an old-timey prophet. So again, it's kind of creating this, all right, so they're going to kind of continue the tradition here. We used to read about these prophets that were out preaching and yelling and kind of in the desert, and maybe they were doing some odd things. Oh, look, that process is continuing here in this gospel, or in this book, so I feel comfortable in this new scripture. Does that make sense? So that's kind of what's happening. But one little thing here. The quote that's coming from the prophet Isaiah, it says, that would be the voice of one crying out. And then there was, in Hebrew, the pause was there, or the colon kind of thing was there. Then it said, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. So you may think, what big difference? But if you think about it for a quick second and think, if we say the voice is coming from the wilderness, you get one image. Somebody out in the desert yelling, hey, everybody listen, get ready, something great's happening. But then if you put the colon a little bit before, just somebody's crying out, and it's in our wilderness where we were supposed to prepare the way of the Lord. Where it's like maybe the wilderness is where we are, not the crier. Like the prophet isn't in the wilderness, we are. And if you think about wilderness, it can be desolate, lonely, scary, maybe like life-threatening, all that kind of stuff. And if you think about if that's where we are, if we're in this wilderness, that's where we need to kind of open our hearts up to open our lives to the Lord. Does that make sense? So I think that's a little bit of a difference. You think, just the placement of a colon could make a little bit of a difference there, but it kind of does. And if you think about it, so maybe here, this is a message of hey, open your hearts. Your life may be kind of in a wilderness for you right now, but let's open our heart a little bit now because something new is going to happen. If that makes sense. And so anyway, that's a little grammatical, whatever. So all right, let's see. So let me say a couple things here. Just another passage I wanted to kind of show you real quick in the Gospel of Mark, and it's in chapter 5, verse 1, and it says, okay. So here, Jesus, like I said, it's this series of sort of events and parables and things that Jesus is doing, sort of strung together. Here's one of them, and I think this is interesting to me. So this is the passage. It says, they came to the other side of the sea into the country of the Gerasenes, or Gadarenes would be anyway. So they were in another place, which would have been primarily Gentile area. So that was kind of, okay, well, all right, here we are. So this is a little bit of an invitation to the Gentiles. All right, we can be part of this. They're there. And when he stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains. But the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. So here he's in chains. This guy's possessed, and he's in chains. Night and day among the tombs, blah, blah, blah. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, what have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Please do not torment me. For he said, then Jesus said, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. And then he said, what is your name? My name is Legion, for we are many. And he begged him not to send him out of the country. He begged him not to send him out of the country.
Down the hillside was this great herd of swine that was eating. And the unclean spirits begged him, send us into the swine and let us enter them. So he sends them to the swine, you first. And then they run into the water there. They run into the water. Let's see. They rush to the steep bank and into the sea where they drown. Okay. So here's kind of an interesting kind of a thing. Okay. However this unfolded, whatever happened. But think about how the words that are being used. This poor unclean spirit guy is in chains and shackles. So that's bad. But he breaks out of them. So if we kind of were to think back, what happened in the book of Exodus? The people, the Israelite people, were in chains and shackles, enslaved by a horrible, unclean spirit in a way. You know, when you think about it? So here's this guy is shackled by this unclean spirit, literally and physically. And then Jesus sets him free. And then what happens to this unclean spirit? It goes and dumped into the sea, just like those Egyptians. Those people. Who were they? Yeah, the Egyptians. Yeah, they got crashed into the sea. So look at that. It's like a new freedom, a new set free kind of thing. So isn't that cool? That we maybe that will be lost on us, I think, for us today. But it's there. It's there. I think nobody who would have been at this time would have missed that analogy. So what's cool is this intertwine. That well, there's lots of things neat about it, but that first it's in this sort of Gentile geographic place, but here's this key significant Israelite Judaic history moment being replicated or sort of told in a way that Jesus is the author of that event. So it's a whoa. I mean, imagine if we'd heard that oh, wow, he's really something else. This is really something big. You know, when you think about it, that what's happening there, that Jesus is the author of this unshackling and casting the evil spirit into the sea. Just like in the Old Testament, it was God the Father, image there. So you can kind of see that makes sense. So I think that's fascinating. Also, the word legion, I always wonder why legion. So it's because that would have been the word for it would have been a definite word for an army or it would have been like an army. So that no wonder the legion was cast into the sea. That's again another sort of linguistic connection there.
It's quantity, I think, from legion. I think it's like a military quantity.
So just you would have been image like thousands, because even in here the swine numbering about 2,000 rushed into. So yeah. Thanks for that. Thank you. So okay, if I can give another thing from Mark, I'm breaking my own little idea here that I would give one passage, but this other one thing that I wanted to say was also in chapter 5, verse 21. Okay, so this is one of my favorite things. So if I could just share it real quick. So this is really very soon, just a couple of stories after what we just saw. So again, remembering kind of that Jesus is trying or that the author's trying to couch Jesus as friendly to Gentiles as well as to the Judaic people. So it says, when Jesus crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue. Okay, leader of the synagogue. That would have been a big thing. Named Jairus. He has a name. So a leader who has a name. Okay, that's a big deal. A lot of times these people you don't really hear their name. So to name someone sort of elevated them just initially. So Jairus came and saw him, and he fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death." So, this is big. So you can see she's at the point of death. "Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be well and alive." So he went with him. So he went along, and a large crowd followed him, and everybody was kind of crowding around him. But here in the middle, he's going to go do a miracle to this very important situation. A named person who's is a leader in the community is saying, "You got to come save my young daughter because she's going to die if you don't." So big deal happening. And all this crowd's going with him. But then it says, now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. Okay, she had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. So here's a person, unnamed, like has this situation that would have been considered unclean because anything with blood was considered unclean. So no, we don't do that. So we don't connect with that. So like that, no. Then the fact that it had been 12 years of hemorrhages. 12 is a big number of like kind of whole or whatever, like this kind of perfection thing. So the fact that 12 years, that means she was like perfectly unclean, in a way. Kind of like Mary Magdalene last week with the 7 demons. But it's the number 12 also just as a holistic sort of number. And so here this is a bad situation for her. So here's somebody who's totally and utterly outside the community, but somehow she's here at this moment in the middle of this big deal going on. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and she just touched his cloak. And she said, just touch his clothes, maybe I'll be made well. Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped. Like, no hoo-ha about it. Just boom, just stop. Okay? She felt her body and that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that the power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? And I love this line. When the disciples like, you see the crowd as everybody's around you. How can you ask that? Like, whatever. But that's a paraphrase. But then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told the whole truth. He said, your daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. So this amazing story that's like, here's this big thing happening, and then here comes this little interlude. Here it kind of stops, and that this woman who had been outside the community, almost maybe identifying with a Gentile, feeling like, I'm outside this, they see me as unclean, I'm a Gentile, I'm no good, but yet here, I'm going to come and just be a part of this, and so it's your faith made you clean. You didn't have to do anything, you didn't have to get circumcised, you didn't have to jump through hoops, you didn't have to say an incantation, you're just here, you know what I mean? So I think that was a message too, in that way, if that makes sense. And it's a message to us right now, but a message then too. Okay, then back to the main plot. Then it says, while he was still speaking, some people in the leader's house, your daughter's dead. Like, she's already dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, don't fear, only believe. He allowed no one to follow him in. When he came to the house of the leader, he saw a commotion. People weeping and wailing loudly. They were oftentimes like people that's what they did. And when he had entered, he said to them, why do you make a commotion and weep? This child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him, and they couldn't believe it. Then he says, Talitha koum, which means little girl, get up. And immediately the girl got up and began to walk around. So actually, it's interesting that, I forget where it says this, that she's 12 years old. So this image of a 12-year-old, really, this may sound like, what are you, crazy? That was like getting ready for her to be married. So like, so that at 12. But like, that's gross. But like, think about like that, but like that, a 12-year-old or somebody at this very, very key important age, and she's getting ready to be married, which would have meant that life would have come. So in a way, Jesus is allowing for a new life, and in a way of allowing for her life, not only in her ability to be able to rise in this way, but also that she's going to go on and have a family and be okay that way. So I think that the intertwining again of these two stories, how they kind of come together in this, I think, isn't that cool how they did that? Like sort of included in this little story as a little subplot. But the message, I think, to all of us is, hey, we don't have to be the big headliner. We don't have to be, that kind of thing. But maybe we're kind of like this little woman in the middle, just touching, hoping for the best, and great things can be there. But then also to the people at the time, hey, look, these Jewish people, they seem to be chewing up the whole story because they're the ones that are big headline makers. But here we are, a little bit here too. Don't forget us. And it's there. It's clear. It's there. So I don't know. Did that make sense? So I think like I like that, and I like it how it can be for us today too. Kind of this message of then and now. All right. So let's switch over to the Gospel of Matthew real quick. So let's see. Just Matthew real quick. There's a zillion things, of course, that we could pull out and have to use restraint to pull out one or two things on that. So okay. So if we look at Matthew, okay, again, the very beginning, primarily Jewish audience, but with the purpose of not only like, hey, I want you to believe in Jesus, but maybe there are people that already are connected to Christ in the early Christian community and the way as it was, but also maybe this would probably have been a group of people that had become very insular. I mean, like
I think, Assyrians and Babylon had been bad to them, and I mean, all their history had been wrought by external people trying to take their land or trying to kind of take them away from who they really were and all that kind of stuff. And so here they were, and so I think they probably carried some of that. Like, I want to be a nationalist a little bit. Like, I just want to keep to myself. Let's just keep to our own thing. So there's a challenge that sneaks in here pretty regularly about in the Gospel of Matthew about hey, let's be a little bit open-minded here. Come on, let's be a little bit welcoming to the Gentile. So there's shout-outs for that throughout. So but that being said, here's this very first passage right out of the gate in the very beginning of the book of Matthew, and it says an account of the genealogy. So it's interesting that here the genealogy is Genesis. So again, not only with Mark, here's the beginning of the book, blah, 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 but then here again the word Genesis is used at the beginning. So it is, in a way, at the beginning of the book of Genesis says, in the beginning this and that. Mark, in the beginning this and that. And then now here, in the beginning this and that. So you can kind of see how it's just a consistent. So it's almost like right from the first words creating a welcome for people that have been familiar in the Torah. So this is interesting because it starts off, the very first thing. I feel like if I was going to write a book, I probably wouldn't start with something like this. It seems really boring. A list of long names, like oh no, nobody's gonna buy my book if they just get the first, they read that intro in Amazon, they're never gonna buy this thing. But somehow it worked, and here we are, 2,000 years still buying it. And so it says, here it goes, an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah. So right here at the beginning, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So then it goes on, and it goes, Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah. Okay, then it goes on for these generations. So it goes through, let's see, I think it's 7 generations here that go through, and that first 1/3 of it, if you look at them, they're all people that were family. Like really, they were the ancestors or the kind of the forebearers. We kind of call that like the ancestors. Abraham and Jacob and Judah and Aram, Aminadab. They're all like they would have all been kind of considered family in a way. So here's this family. Then it comes down to King David. And that first 1/3 is family. Okay, so hang on to that. Then the second it comes, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, which is an unusual route. And Solomon, the father of Rehoboam, Rehoboam the father of Abijah, Abijah the father of Asa. And then it goes on through these generations, and everyone who's listed there was a king, or some sort of royalty or a king of the institution, a king of the Israelite thing. So all of them. I mean, Hezekiah is there, Amos is there, Jeconiah, they're all there. Then it goes down to the deportation of Babylon. That was that. So then that's an unusual situation. So here, the first 1/3 is basically family. The second 1/3 is basically all kings or institutional kings in a way. Then the third part, and after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, and then it goes on and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the deportation of Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. So here it is. That's the genealogy. So apparently genealogies were used a lot. Like if we were going to comb through the Old Testament, we'd probably find a bunch of genealogies. It was sort of a literary way of sort of making somebody more important. Because, they didn't have like a 23andMe thing that they really could come up with a family tree. I mean, they were just sort of like, it was just like they wrote things in to kind of make it, to sort of build up who the person was. And kind of the longer the genealogy, the more important the person was. So this is right in the family of that literary genre of saying, look, here comes somebody big, the Messiah, and we're going to connect him all the way back to Abraham. Abraham being the father, of the whole Israelite Jewish enterprise. And so, but then it being broken down into family and then institution or leaders. And then that third group, they're not mentioned anywhere. Like there's not any other scriptural reference to like Zerubbabel or Jeconiah or anything. These are a bunch of nobodies in a way. I mean, nobody's a nobody, but like, you know what I mean? Like as far as like headline making, they're just not headliners. So I think that's awesome because here Jesus, the Messiah, comes into the world despite a family, through a family, through a royalty or an institution, and through a bunch of people that are just really not that important. And so if you think about it, like if you look at some of the stuff that's going on in this family in the first 1/3, that's some goofy stuff. Like so and so lied to somebody about who they're, you know, there's a lot of conniption and going on, you know, things that are going on there. So despite the dysfunction of this family, the Messiah is still here. And then you think about what's going on with these kings. That's not a lot of good stuff either. Like Rehoboam, you're having a fight with Jeroboam and then dividing the kingdom, and then what David was doing and wife of Uriah and all that. And then that's not, so here, despite the weaknesses of the difficulties of the institution, still the Messiah is here. The difficulties in the church here, the Messiah is still here. And then here, despite the fact that they're not headliners, they're just sort of average people, the Messiah is still here. So if you think about it in our life, here we're part of family, and the Messiah, Christ, is in us, and we're a part of an institution that maybe the church or our city or whatever, and still Christ is here. And then maybe we're not the biggest headliners, you know, we're not the president or the king or anything, but Christ is still here with us. You know what I mean? So here's this window into the past of seeing what this genealogy was really doing, and here it is today. It can mean something to us in a pretty cool way. A genealogy, you would think that all that would have been there. Did any of that make sense or connect a little bit? So anyway, I love that. So I want to, everybody on Christmas, we should skip that because nobody wants to hear that. Like, there's no one chance on Christmas, but it's one of the options for Christmas, you know, on Christmas Day. Don't read that, they'll never come back. Like, so man, it's so great, you know, it's got so much there. Anyway, like it. So all right. So that's one thing I wanted to say in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew. And then a couple of other things I kind of wanted to say, just maybe early on. We know, like I kind of mentioned this last week, that Matthew and Luke, and would have been that the death and resurrection would have been written first, historically. Then the aspects of Jesus' life, and then probably a little bit even more significant time, and then the first 2 chapters would have been written about the genealogy and the infancy narratives and stuff. And so this would have been probably written a little bit later, but it's kind of interesting just to say a couple things here about this. That it's primarily here in when I'll just kind of say, okay, here, okay, there was a group of magi, and you know we always think it's 3, but that's because there were 3 gifts. Gold, we know what that is. Frankincense and myrrh would have been like resin, like some sort of resin that you could burn. It had like a certain odor. So that was kind of like a thing of, all those were sort of used in sort of like magic or like astrological type of activities in an Eastern, you know, kind of non-Jewish country. So this was sort of a way of saying to the reader, maybe, hey, you know, if you're Jewish people, look, here at the very beginning are these people that are practicing in a way that we think is pagan and no good, but yet they're coming to be a part of this. And it's interesting that they leave the resin and behind. They leave that frankincense and all that stuff. They're gifts, but they leave that stuff behind, and then they go back a different way. They go back, you know, another way. And it's interesting too. When they first come, they're sort of aligning with Herod. You know, they're kind of connecting with Herod. Then they encounter Christ, and they leave their sort of their astrological stuff behind, and they leave Herod behind, and then they go back, you know, another way. So it's interesting that like. It says that that they go home another way, but I wonder if that really means that they left for their own country by another road. And so I wonder if like it meant that like they went physically another road, but it also could mean that they went and their heart was different too. That their life path took them a different way too. You know, I kind of like that image. And then it says that Joseph heard the message in a dream. So there's another connection to the Old Testament because Joseph could interpret dreams, the earlier Joseph in the Old Testament. And here Joseph is getting it in a dream to take the child and his mother and go to Egypt. And here we are again. Then salvation comes out of Egypt. After they come from Egypt, then Jesus comes back. So it's all very similar to how Moses' life was because
they slaughtered those kids thinking that they were going to get Jesus. So it's, all that is very, very Old Testament. So you can just see again kind of a messaging to the people there of the Jewish tradition. Then you could go back and kind of say more about Matthew, that there are 5 different discourses that Jesus gives, which could be connecting to the 5 books of the Torah. You see Jesus preaching on the mountain at the Sermon on the Mount. And it's some of the most beautiful things, it's a new law that's being given. When you think about what's being given in the Beatitudes. So those are kind of amazing things. So what if we jump to Luke real quick, and then we can maybe have a chance to talk about it a little bit. Let's see. Let me make sure. No. All right. So let's see. So Luke. Okay. Luke here, he kind of differs from the other 3, and that there's not an in the beginning thing. It doesn't say in the beginning like the other 3 do. So because he's primarily writing to people who are Gentile, and so Luke was the name would have been like some sort of physician, at the time. That's kind of the indicator. But here it's interesting, since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that were handed on to us. I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. So that's pretty fascinating, because I think that if you think about the name Theophilus, I think I feel like authors have debated, who's Theophilus? Where was he? What was his story? Well, the word Theophilus, like philia means love, friendly love, and theos means God, and so it's really friend of God. So it could have been somebody's name, but it also could have been like me and you, that we're friends of God, that we love God, that we're friends with God, and it's being written to us today. So I love that image, that means something, that here that the gospel is coming to us as friends of God. So that's an amazing thing. And including that anybody would read this would be seen as a friend of God. So okay, then here in the beginning of the first 2 of the beginning of the book of Luke, that there were those 2 chapters probably written later, but yet still really are amazing. There's some stuff in here that's just unbelievable. So if I could just say just briefly how awesome this passage that Mary said. So it's almost again like 2 stories weave together. It's the birth of John the Baptist and then the birth of Jesus kind of weave together. And the intersecting point is when Mary goes to see Elizabeth. And they get together. And then it's like Mary is there, and then she just feels the need to belt out this song in a way. It's like a musical. And she stops to sing this song, and she sings, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant." And this is, I think, one of those beautiful things ever. And he showed strength with his arm. He scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good and sent the rich away empty. I mean, that's turning the society on its head in a way. This is very, very challenging. In fact, like in Latin America, where around liberation theology, this passage was deleted out. Like people couldn't read it in there because of this sort of empowering people that were not in power. And so that's amazing, I think. And I think the fact that this is here, it does it mirrors a passage from the Old Testament, but it sort of puts a new twist on it. So I think this is a beautiful passage. I can't say enough about it. It's a poem that's written here, and it really does feel like she's like a aria in an opera, or like a song that she's kind of belts out in a musical or something. Just kind of stop and think about this stuff, which is so key and so important, and really just the essence of what Jesus was all about, the way right there from the beginning. Anyway, so let's see one more thing about the Gospel of Luke, or one more passage here. So here's kind of an old familiar passage that I think is really important. Okay, here at verse 10, chapter 10, verse 29. Okay, so there's a lot here. Okay, here we go. So, wanting to justify himself. Okay, wait. A lawyer stood up to Jesus and said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Which is a loaded question. He's just trying to get at it, He said to him, "What is then Jesus said to him, what is written in the law? What do you read there? And he answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. So here is taking, in this passage, something that everybody would have had, that love the Lord God with your heart, soul, strength, love the Lord with all you've got, was we talked about this when we did the Old Testament, that Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 is the Shema, like, hear this. Everybody hear this. That this is important. You need to bind it on your wrist. You need to put it on your forehead. You need to put it on your doorway. That passage. Love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, strength. It's everything. It means everything. So that everybody would say, okay, good, got that. I'm down with that. Then he digs up some little passages in the middle of the book of Leviticus. Is anybody really reading Leviticus? And so they pull that thing out and pull that little out. Love your neighbor as yourself. And so, wait, you're equating love your neighbor as yourself with this thing that we've tied to our wrists and our foreheads and our doorposts. There, you're putting them on the same level. That's new. That's wow. That's a new statement. So this is just a recreation of the law in a way. All the law hangs on this: love of God and love of neighbor. So, that's right there is a blow your mind kind of thing. Then then Jesus says, okay, this is right. But then that guy pushed it a little further, and he said, who is my neighbor? Okay, so probably in Leviticus, when that was written, and probably no one was reading anyway, that Leviticus meant love your neighbor literally meant your neighbor. So it certainly didn't mean an Assyrian or a Babylonian or somebody that was trampling on your lawn or something. It certainly didn't mean any of that. It meant you're literally the people that were like you, that were with you, that were like you. And you know what? It makes sense, I think. No wonder that law would have made sense in the Leviticus time period. Because you start putting your trust in some Assyrian, they're going to take you over. Or maybe it was sort of like a sort of a tribal mentality that we got to stick in this together. I mean, survival means we stick together. But this is a new way. It's a new way. So if that makes sense. So then, you know the story that's coming probably. Jesus replied, just starts telling the story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place, saw him, passed on the other side. But a Samaritan. Okay, so just to say real quick, this priest and this Levite, big people, I mean, probably wearing some pretty fancy getup, pretty fancy robes, and kind of like people looking at them, they misunderstood, I think, or maybe they bought into that Old Testament mindset that you can only go to the temple to find the Lord. That the temple or the synagogue, that was where your sacrifice was. That's where God was. So I'm tunnel vision. I can only find God in church, basically. Forgetting that you can find God on the side of the road. Forgetting that you can find God on the side of the road. That here, the temple is the place. So that's fascinating. They've missed the point in a way. They are doing what they think is absolutely right. There's probably a bloody guy there. Blood is impure. We saw that earlier. He's on the side of the road. I got to get to church or I'm going to be late, and so I need to get there to that temple. That's where it is. So you kind of see. But then here comes a Samaritan while traveling came near him. Now Samaritans, I think like today we think, oh, the Good Samaritan. We name things Good Samaritan and stuff like that. Well, like Samaritans then were the people that had been left behind because many of the wealthy and educated had been taken away during the Babylonian exile. And they were carried away to Babylon and locked up there. But then there were people that were left behind, and some of them blended their Jewish religious practices with the pagan people, the Babylonian people there. And so they kind of watered down their religion. So when people came back, they saw the Samaritan as just anathema, just like bad people. You've given up on our thing. You did it wrong. This is bad. We're not going to. So like you're obviously the enemy. Do you kind of get it? And that just got deeper and deeper as time went on. So it was 100 years later, but still we hate him, right? So that's the deal. So along comes this guy who probably didn't really even understand what the Levite or the priest was doing, but he comes along and says, I moved with pity. He bandaged up his wounds, poured wine on them, brought him to an inn and a place to take care of him. and he left out. He gave out 2 denarii to the innkeeper and said, "Take care of him until I come back." And so that's the story. So that is an amazing story because, again, if you think about it in the context of writing to a Gentile audience and saying, "Hey, look, you guys have been outcast, but maybe you all got it after all. You can get it after all. That even though you've been outcast just like the Samaritan guy, that you could be part of it too, and you couldn't understand that what's going on. That don't miss the point. God is not only in the temple. God is in this Samaritan on the side of the road, which kind of goes along to this real theme of Jesus. So in the Gospel of Luke, that is, he's traveling towards Jerusalem to kind of create a bit of a longing or a home or a connection to the place of Jerusalem, because the Gentiles probably didn't have that kind of connection automatically like the Jewish people did. But then you see, it's almost like that around Jesus is becoming a temple. That like the temple can be found in other places. That's just one example of it. That the temple is not the only place that you can find God. So there's a couple things there historically. Again, to the Gentile people that probably didn't have that home, that recognition or connection to the temple, but also that the temple had been destroyed. And so that they felt like that they were going to lose their relationship with God or lose their connection to God. And so that was a way of saying, hey, look, we can be wherever we are. We can find the love of God and live out this greatest commandment, even on the side of the road with a guy that we're supposed to hate. So do you see that? Like, that's kind of the message. That's still the message to us today. Like, I mean, how many times are we a jerk to the person in the parking lot when we're going to church because they're cutting us off? You know what I mean? I gotta get you late for church. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? So, like, that's kind of the same thing. So we don't want to be the priest and Levite and miss the point. These poor guys, they just didn't get it, and now they're the foil for all centuries. You know what I mean? So well, I carried on too much about. I'd like to say 1,000 more things, but what if I just said one thing about the Gospel of John? Just real quick here. So, all right. Okay. If we looked at the beginning of the other three. So, just the beginning of this one says, just like the other three, creating a bit of a home. Okay, it says, in the beginning, just like Mark, just like Matthew, and then just like the book of Genesis. In the beginning was the Word, Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. So that is a really intense theological statement about the presence of Christ throughout, and that like it's a much more developed sort of theology than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You could just hear it. You're like, I mean, just the language is just really different, just a different understanding. But that term logos, if you remember, like when we talk about the Old Testament, that there's that word davar is a Hebrew word, and it means not only word, but it also means sort of essence or part of something, or sort of like the thick of something, like that, sort of the essence of something. And so here, that's what's this word logos in Greek is the same thing, like an essence of something. It's not just a word, but like it means that the word was with God, meaning that this essence, this reality was always there, always a part of it, of this universe. So I think that's amazing. So we think about the authorship of this, and we see that the Gospel of John, well, probably wasn't John person, but like Johannine literature, we sort of call it. But there's this beloved disciple that keeps appearing. And so you wouldn't believe the amount of scholarship that has been, ink that's been spilled on who was the beloved disciple. And what was that? Who was that? Well, the thing the one that made the most sense to me, this isn't like, who knows for sure, but like, it makes sense that the beloved disciple is the reader. That like, it never says John, the beloved disciple, or, Mary, the beloved disciple. It just says the beloved disciple. And where is that beloved disciple throughout the Gospel of John? He shows up they show up at the Last Supper, at the foot of the cross, and at the resurrection, at the empty tomb. I mean, some pretty key times. So right there, a frontline witness to help understand and interpret what these amazing things that are happening to Jesus. So if we think about it, if the beloved disciple is like you and me reading this, if we insert ourselves into this, there we are. We're part of the story. We're a witness to the resurrection. We're a witness to the death of Christ at the cross. So when I think about that, like I think about like my sister sitting with my
sick niece. There she's a beloved disciple at the foot of the cross when my niece was sick. Or like there's maybe somebody that's there during a moment of great joy, that there's a beloved disciple witnessing the resurrection, and somebody that's graduating and we never thought they'd graduate. Or things like that. That like the beloved disciple being there at present at different important points. So who knows what the author really meant, but I just find that to be a really great sort of image of who the beloved disciple is or could be. Just me and you, that we're there, part of the story. So I love that. I think I'm overblowing my time. So so I don't know if there's anything about. The one thing I wanted to say at the end is that like all this stuff that like I feel like I've been lucky enough to learn and super psyched to share is like it's really amazing, and it's all written here in this book. But really, I mean, it's the book is amazing, but it's our lives that really what it means. It means our life is good news. We are called to live the gospel and be the gospel and do that like the beloved disciple, be witnesses to it, but also be there in it. And so I feel like the gospel it can be us sharing it. So that's the big message. So I don't know if there's a question or a thought or anything. Yes.
I have a rabbit hole.
Yeah, go. Yeah, great.
I was thinking about the, casting out the demons. And I always think that the people who are possessed in the Bible, if we met them today, we would say that they were mentally ill.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that maybe the biblical writers were a little more enlightened about mental illness than we think we are, because they could separate the person from the illness. But once the demon was cast out, then the person was, once it was cured, the person was whole and acceptable to the community.
As they were. Yeah.
And I think we know so much more, and we've got pills for this and pills for that. But the person in our minds is still sick or possessed. We don't ever really consider them whole again.
And the fact that Jesus was there looking with him in the eye, like right there with him. And what have we done through history with that condition is lock people away. We don't want to think about it, in a way. Thank you. That's a really good insight. That's a great insight. Yeah, that we forget. Yeah, that we don't define this person by that. Yeah, that's really neat. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
I have a confession. Can you help me, Father?
Yes.
So I'm down with the Samaritan, my neighbor. I have a harder time with the Levites and the priests than the robbers and the rich. Can you help me?
Oh, I think I should be confessing with you probably, but being a social worker, but like I feel like that maybe that like the response to that is in that Magnificat. That like what do we how? I mean, I feel like there's one side of that story which is helping one guy on the side of the road, but then there's Christ like shouting out to all the people and shouting at you, brood of vipers, and all these people that are stealing and taking from the people. He was trying to bring about a systemic change too. I think Jesus was a systemic change person, not just a one-on-one person. He did both to try to upend that system. I like Jesus as a systemic change person too, because that's a system that allows that to happen, allows robbers to need to rob, and that. Thank you.